Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It seems that I remember scattered shreds of far-off days. The savage beat of soldiers' feet on streets of broken glass that crush the lie of justice. England brings to foreign lands. The truth came out without a doubt in 1969.
On the brink of war, a Newsnight special as Parliament prepares to make up its mind on Syrian airstrikes. Good evening. This time tomorrow night, barring unforeseen events, MPs will have voted on whether to send British fighter planes to bomb IS in Syria. For some parliamentarians, the agonising will continue until the last moment. Just this evening, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee narrowly approved a resolution stating that the Prime Minister had not adequately addressed its concerns over airstrikes. Meanwhile, the Stop the War coalition have been protesting outside Labour Party HQ. There will be Conservatives who vote against and Labour MPs who vote for. But if David Cameron gets his way, our bombs could be aimed at IS targets almost immediately after the vote. So, on the eve of this momentous decision, we're devoting Newsnight to debating the arguments for and against. I'm joined by politicians, Syrians, passionate advocates for military action, and others equally passionate about the perils of joining the Americans, the French, the Saudis, and the Russians. First tonight, a brief reminder of how we got to this point. It was bombing campaigns by President Assad's forces that led to a dramatic recall of Parliament in August 2013. The call to arms followed a suspected chemical weapons attack on the outskirts of the capital Damascus on the 21st of August, in which hundreds of people are reported to have died. The US and the UK said that the Assad government was behind the attack. In the event, the coalition government's motion was defeated 285 votes to 272. David Cameron said he would respect that defeat.
It is clear to me that the British Parliament, reflecting the views of the British people, does not want to see British military action. I get that, and the government will act accordingly.
By then, a new threat had emerged. Early in March 2013, Islamic fighters had entered the northeastern city of Raqqa, and soon it became the capital of the so-called Islamic State. By the following June, in Iraq, ISIS forces had overrun both Fallujah and Mosul, two key Iraqi cities. They quickly declared a caliphate across Iraq and Syria, calling for global allegiance. 2 months later, the city of Sinjar was captured and 5,000 Yazidi men killed. Within a week, President Obama authorized the first airstrikes. 10 days later, ISIS uploaded a video entitled Message to America. It shows the beheading of the American hostage, James Foley. It featured a masked militant with an English accent. This militant became known as Jihadi John, and more gruesome videos of beheadings followed. In September, the US announced the formation of a coalition to destroy the threat posed by ISIS, and US warplanes began to bomb Raqqa. By September, France had joined in airstrikes over Syria in coordination with the US. Within days, Russia entered the war, carrying out its first airstrikes in Syria hours after parliamentary approval in Russia. On November the 13th, Paris suffered a devastating series of attacks, leaving 130 dead and many more injured. ISIS also claimed attacks in Tunisia, Beirut, and the downing of the Russian tourist plane over Sinai. These recent attacks have galvanized governments to prepare joint airstrikes to degrade and eradicate ISIS. Now let's introduce our two panels now. Supporting airstrikes in Syria are the Labour MP Mary Cray, the Times columnist David Aronovich, and Sharon Tabari of the Legatum Institute. Against are the Conservative MP John Barron, the commentator Matthew Paris, and the Syrian academic Reem Turkmani. We will address three central issues in this debate tonight, and each side will make their case. In front of them, an audience of people, a few of whom have a special perspective on the debate, and the rest who are undecided on the arguments for or against. So let's hear from a few of them now. First of all, Diane, what is it that you want to hear that will help you make up your mind?
I think I really need to hear the plans for afterwards. I want to know that it's been thought through.
And moving on now to Mary, what are you concerned about?
What added value the British will give in this involvement, given that, you know, other countries are already involved in this conflict.
And finally at this stage, Mary, what are you so worried about?
So I'm worried about not repeating the same mistakes of Iraq.
And that's, you want to hear us definitively that we won't be doing that if we go into Syria.
Exactly.
Right, well, thank you very much. We'll be coming back to you in the course of the programme. The first question we want to address is the military rationale for UK involvement. With several major powers already raining bombs down on IS, can we, with our overstretched military, really make any meaningful difference? And even if we can make a difference from the air, who is going to fight the ground war that everyone agrees is necessary if IS is to be defeated? Do the 70,000 moderate Syrian opposition troops that David Cameron talks of even exist? First, David Aronovich, a minute, please, in support of Syrian airstrikes.
What MPs are being asked to do tomorrow is not to start a war. There's been one of those in Syria for 4 years in which 300,000 Syrians have died and 5 million have sought refuge abroad, or to bomb Syria, but to extend the scope of existing British airstrikes against ISIS from Iraq over the non-existent border. Our allies, not least the French, have requested this of us. Germany responded to France's request for help earlier today. Militarily, it will add to the existing pressure on the beheaders, enslavers, rapists and amputators of Daesh and assist forces such as the Kurds and non-jihadi Syrian resistance fighters who, not Assad, have borne the brunt of the anti-ISIS fight. It'll do something to diminish the capacity of Daesh to plan attacks on European streets and Mediterranean beaches. It will not end the Syrian civil war, which we and others have stood back from for so long, and it will not, in and of itself, magically destroy ISIS. Eventually, that will be accomplished by ground forces, probably consisting of local allies assisted by special forces from Western powers. It doesn't detract from the need for a peace process in the area, which we'll talk about later. But right now, concretely, British forces can help damage ISIS and give succour and encouragement to our friends. And that's something worth doing.
Thank you, David Aronovich. And now, John Barron, the case against.
At a time when already too many aircraft are chasing too few targets, many in Parliament are concerned that in the absence of a long-term strategy, both military and non-military, then we risk repeating past errors, such as in Iraq, Helmand and Libya, and would have made the mistake of in Syria 2 years ago had Parliament not stopped the government intervening on behalf of the rebels. Airstrikes alone will not succeed. What we need is a comprehensive strategy. On the non-military front, we need to make sure we do more to address issues such as why aren't we disrupting Daesh's, ISIL's business interests, financial flows and prominence on social media. But on the military front, the key question, which government cannot answer really with any certainty, is who is going to supply the local ground forces to actually defeat Daesh on the ground. And if we cannot answer that question, then it begs all sorts of other questions as well. And the idea that there are 70,000 moderates left, even if there are, we risk ignoring the lesson of Libya when once the common enemy was defeated, that coalition of forces against Gaddafi fragmented into 1,000 militias and a further civil war pursued. These are just one of the questions we need to answer, and there have been no answers forthcoming as such.
John Barron, thank you very much. Now, your leader, the Prime Minister, said tonight at a meeting of the 1922 committee that those who will be voting with Jeremy Corbyn are really terrorist sympathisers. How do you feel about being called a terrorist sympathiser by your own Prime Minister?
Well, I don't comment on meetings such as the 22. That is supposed to be a private meeting. All I will say is I've served in the army. I've served on the streets of Northern Ireland.
You were a captain in the infantry?
I was. I was a platoon commander in Northern Ireland, and I do think we must not resort to such language. Instead, we should look at the actual evidence before us, and there is clearly a lack of ground forces to take Daesh on, and that's one of the key issues we've got to address.
Let me just put that straight back to David Aronovich. You know, air power, it won't be necessarily just symbolic from us, but it's not going to be the big game changer one would think. And what's actually needed is some kind of support for these 70,000 ground troops who, frankly, are too busy fighting Assad and are not going to move that position unless we can guarantee protection from IS?
Well, firstly, can I say there's a fallacy in this which is pretty kind of dramatic, really, which is the idea that this is not also happening in Iraq. ISIS isn't just in Syria, it's in Iraq too, and consequently the ground forces that it faces are partially in Iraq. When you come to the ground forces, so if you're talking about who eventually is going to take Raqqa, the answer to that is I don't actually know who's eventually going to take Raqqa, but I do know who's going to take Raqqa is going to take it quicker if you degrade ISIS's military capability.
Well, Matthew Parris, just coming to you on this. I mean, there is actually logically no point to being a mile and a half away in Iraq and not being in Syria.
In Iraq, we're supporting a democratically elected, legitimate government. We're not doing any such thing in Syria. You can always chase people over the border. The international law of hot pursuit allows you to do that. And I do find it surprising that David says he doesn't actually know who's going to take Raqqa, but we can kind of work all that out once we've vaporised ISIL.
Well, Mary Cray, the other argument about the problematic nature of the military engagement is that Barack Obama has said tonight, it's not because we don't have enough forces to deal with IS, it's the fact that right now we don't have enough targets. Isn't that the problem? This isn't a well worked out strategy. IS don't operate in a way that you can pin them down so easily.
Well, I was present at a briefing with the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, and I asked this question about the 70,000 forces, and I got the answer. There are 40,000 forces, and then there are 30,000, perhaps, Islamic forces, but who are willing to be part of a political settlement. And then there's others, 20,000, much more Islamist forces who are not willing to be part of that settlement. So I think there is complexity on the ground, but those Free Syrian Army forces have been degraded over time by Assad, and if we carry on doing nothing in Syria, there will be no opposition to Assad. There will be nobody on the ground to take over ISIS when they are defeated.
David can't tell us who's going to take Raqqa. Who will actually take Raqqa from IS?
I hope that it will be local forces on the ground. And one of the advice that we had from the Lieutenant General who was there today was that actually they want it to be local forces, they want it to be local people, they don't want it Kurds, but obviously there'll be territorial limits to where they want to go. But what they don't want is Western forces coming in because they don't think that that is helpful locally. Well,
let's come to a Syrian and tell me what you're against military action. Tell Mary Cray why you don't think that strategy will work, Muzna.
Well, it's strange to hear you talking about Syria, debating the wrong question, and actually thinking, who is going to come and take Raqqa? So if the Free Syrian Army is being bombed every single day, and they are dealing with barrel bombs, how do you think they are going to come and take grounds as you command them to do? They are not your forces. They have their battle to fight, which is the Assad. How are you, if you don't debate the right question, if you don't have the right priority, you're not going to defeat ISIS, you're not going to solve the problems in Syria, and you're certainly going to add to the tragedy of the Syrian people.
It's the wrong question, David Aronovich.
Can I just come back at that? Right. Because this was the question that you asked of us, so this is the question we're answering. I totally agree with you. And my concern, having met with Syrian refugees in Lebanon 2 months ago, is how we tackle Assad's reign of terror. And I'm very clear that a man who uses cluster munitions and chemical weapons against his own people cannot be allowed to continue unchecked. And I believe passionately that Syrian lives matter in all of this. What we need to see is a timetable for Assad to go.
But your leader has a different view. He may believe Syrian lives matter, but he's not prepared to vote for airstrikes.
Well, this has been a very difficult debate, and I think we've seen people on all sides of the House will be voting with their conscience tomorrow, and there's a wide range of opinion reflected on this panel and reflected across the parties. But back to the Assad question, we need peace and we need democratic elections in Syria, and that parallel political process is now starting in Vienna.
There's a confusion here. Airstrikes against ISIS are not going to stop the tragedy of the Syrian people. What needs to be discussed in the parliament is the protections of the Syrian civilians in case any other solutions work.
At the same time, the Russians, of course.
The Russians, since the Russians got involved, ISIS has gained so much ground. The Russians are targeting Free Syrian Army, hospitals, and civil society institutions.
But Rim, what do you say to David Cameron's argument that we can't let the French, the Americans, do our work for us? We have to be there, shoulder to shoulder. We have to be using these brimstone bombs. We have to be taking part.
He's saying it as if it's a party that we all have to join.
Yes.
I mean, what is he missing on? I mean, look, it's been a year now of airstrikes against ISIS, and what's the gain in Syria? They actually took Palmyra, the jewel of Syria, during the airstrike. So there are lots of question marks posed by Syrians on these airstrikes and their effectiveness. Indeed. And the attacks in Paris were planned in the suburbs of Brussels and Paris, and they're not in Raqqa. So there are much wider issues to be addressed worldwide.
But it's not a year since American airstrikes helped defend the Turkish town of Kobani on the Syrian-Turkish border and stopped ISIS. Now, that's the kind of action...
They did not defend. ISIS was there only when the Kurds went in to take back their cities. The Americans came in after reluctance, and they... let me finish. And they held... In cooperation with the ground force. So where are the ground force? That should come first.
No. But what I'm saying is that American airstrikes helped maintain Kobani and keep ISIS out of Kobani. And there will be similar other situations in Syria as there are in Iraq, which Britain can conceivably help with. And to me, that alone would be sufficient.
If you continue this model of Kobani, the rest of Syria will be reduced to the ground just like Kobani. What you need is a political solution, first and foremost, so that the regime stops attacking the civilians, the Free Syrian Army, and everyone else, and having all the Syrians framed in a political solution so they fight ISIS. These are the ground forces. There is no more room for more forces. No more room for Syrian fight in this. This is what you should put...
I want to bring John Barron wants to come in as well.
Just two very quick issues. Coming back to David's point, what's the difference between Syria and Iraq? Well, as Matthew says, first of all, we're in Iraq because we were invited to do so. But secondly, there is another fundamental difference, and that is that on the Iraqi payroll, you have hundreds of thousands, if not a million, on the payroll on the security forces side facing Daesh ISIS. In Syria, you have nothing actually of the sort. And having returned from the Middle East last week, the Foreign Affairs Committee went over and had a look. What we are being told, actually, is that there are no or very few moderates left in this civil war, and the idea of turning the Free Syrian Army against Daesh ISIL is just nonsense, absolute nonsense.
Well, we have to move on now to our next area. The government has been careful to insist that bombing Syria is part of a clear diplomatic plan for the future of Syria, involving a representative and legitimate government. The Vienna process is crucial to this. The meeting in Vienna earlier this month was the second time Iran and Saudi Arabia had sat together at the same table, and the 17 parties to the talks have agreed in principle on a way forward, a UN-brokered ceasefire, a transitional government and elections in 2017. But huge questions remain, not least what happens to Bashar al-Assad. So, is the diplomatic strategy sound? Making the case that it's not, in a minute-long speech, is Reem Turkmani.
In the absence of political strategy, no military action is going to achieve its aim. The lack of political legitimacy is the roots of the Syrian crisis. And so building a legitimate state in Syria should be the strategy. This means inclusiveness, power sharing, not excluding whole sections of the society like what happened in Iraq. This means also guaranteeing a constitution that gives the Syrian citizen their equal rights, fair distribution of power, respecting their rights and freedom. The Syrians are dying, taking the risk of dying in the sea in order to reach countries that guarantee these rights. They're not going to countries that are linked to their identity, like Iran and Saudi. So the solution should not be like Iraq, based on the confessional identity. What this means that what we need a strong political solution, an inclusive solution that tackles all the grievances, that gives the Syrian parties the power of politics, the tool of politics rather than arms to settle their differences. This means not dividing the Syrian society into winners and losers, like what happened in Iraq, which will only generate extremism and further conflicts. Only in this way, the Syrian conflict or fight will end, and the Syrian military and other power will be united against ISIS. And all what Syria needs from the rest of the world and Britain to reach this is to support the solution to the conflict, not the parties to the conflict.
Thank you very much indeed. And now the case 4 by Sharan Tabari.
Yes, there are a number of reasons that make me believe that it's time for UK to take military action in Syria. To extend its military action from Iraq to Syria against ISIL. After the Paris attack and President Hollande's request from our lawmakers to vote yes to the military attack in Syria, I think the time has come for it to be done. However, I believe without a comprehensive and overall strategy to win the war and post-conflict plan for military action will not serve the purpose on its own. Therefore, I believe that all forces involved, both allies forces and regional forces, such as Turkey, Saudis, Qatar on the one hand, and Iran and Russia on the other, should sit down together and come up with a comprehensive plan for post-war military action, without addressing the issue of civil war in Syria. ISIL will not be defeated. Bombing now is one step towards preventing ISIL taking more territory and expanding its influence. Next, a comprehensive strategy must be agreed.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, just coming to our guest here, Wayo, from your point of view, you support airstrikes, but do you think that a diplomatic strategy that has been outlined, the Vienna process and so forth, is feasible if Bashar al-Assad is anywhere in the equation?
I understand that ISIS is a serious threat to the global security, and the international community, including the UK, has to respond militarily somehow. However, my biggest concern rather, is what measures are in place to protect civilians. This is one issue. The second issue is that what about the narratives of the battle of narrative? The narratives of hatred and religious supremacy that is fueling ISIS and enabling it to recruit more supporters. The third issue is that ISIS cannot be defeated by airstrikes only. This leads us to the issue of ground intervention. Talking about ground intervention, boots on the ground, who are they, these troops? Are we talking about the Iraqi army and the popular mobilization who are largely sectarian? Are we talking about the Peshmerga and the Kurdish forces?
Let's just, the gentleman behind you, Peter Brearley, you have very direct experience. I mean, your son was killed in 2003, Sean, because of the war in Iraq. When you hear of post-conflict resolution, you look at what happened in Iraq, what does it make you think?
I don't actually think that they've got a clue about post-conflict resolution. When they're talking about dropping the bombs and getting the support after, the very first bomb that's dropped will actually start stopping people joining up to. People are going to die. No, don't anybody think that they're not. People are going to die. People are going to die in Syria as they drop the bombs. The ISIL won't stay there to be bombed. They'll move, as they're already around the world. So what you will get then is, as you've seen in Paris, we're coming up to a really busy time. I'm worried to death that somewhere in England, in some big shopping centre, a little kid going to Santa Claus is going to get blown. It isn't soldiers, it ain't politicians that are going to get blown up.
We're going to come on and talk particularly about that issue of our own safety moment. But just looking at the post-conflict resolution, we've absolutely no idea who's going to be in charge in Syria. We've no idea.
No.
What we want is a democratically elected Syrian government in charge of a Syrian army in order to bring peace to that country. And the Syrians amongst us tonight are united in that goal.
Yeah, united in that goal, but actually, if you look at the factions in Syria, all necessarily working in their own geographical areas for their own ends, without any kind of idea who's going to emerge as a leader, you can't have a resolution.
The Russians and the Iranians, both bigger participants in this than we're ever going to be, are determined to keep Assad in place. I just don't see the beginnings of this international agreement that you're speaking about.
But Assad was the cause of all these problems. I agree with you that I think that Assad should temporarily stay where he is and then gradually to find a coalition or replacement for him. But Assad could not be kept in there, and Iranians know that as well.
But let me just put that to Newsnight. Would any of a Free Syrian Army, would any of the different factions come to the table if Bashar al-Assad was there even for 5 days?
No. People in Syria need their dictator to be taken away from the future of Syria. We've been dying for 5 years to get rid of him. We're not gonna. How can you tell a mother that her son was tortured to death by his forces that he's gonna remain? And not only remain, you are negotiating with him. You are making him legitimate again, and you are making him a partner.
There's some magnificent ironies here, because people like me who supported action against Assad in September 2013, which John and Matthew were very much against, for precisely these sorts of reasons. And of course, the biggest killer in Syria has been Assad and Assad's barrel bombs and so on. The problem for us is that we actually have to try and make a distinction between two situations. The long-term situation in Syria, which is going to be, and actually there was a large amount of agreement between my two colleagues on the right about the sort of general process. The problem is that's going to take a very long time. It involves very many actors who have competing interests and so on. It's very difficult. And in the meantime, we have ISIS and Daesh out there organising.
But if you bomb IS, don't you just shore up Assad? A man who's actually doing business with IS for oil.
Assad, as far as I can see, has never been in the business of taking ISIS out. He could have bombed Raqqa, and there's never been any great kind of Syrian army intervention going towards Raqqa.
But it surely is a defeatist attitude, John Barron, to say that as long as the Russians and the Iranians are there in support of Bashar al-Assad, then there can be no settlement, because that is the equation.
Well, that's the point, you see. I mean, taking David's point, the reason we stopped the government bombing, taking the side of the rebels, my goodness me, aren't we pleased we did that? Because we'd be actually taking the side of ISIL and Daesh, which has since emerged from the rebels. So the government plan to arm the rebels and then bomb Assad was not a coherent one, and I think it illustrates a wider issue. We have a long wish list of what we would like by way of a political settlement,
what's your coherent
but that reinforces the point that actually there is no coherent long-term strategy with regards how we actually defeat Daesh, ISIL. And without that strategy, airstrikes alone, when already too many aircraft are chasing too few targets,
our failures elsewhere, our failures in Libya, our failures in Iraq can't be the barrier to action forever.
No, but we've got to learn the lessons, and one of the key lessons is we've got to realise we've got to have a long-term, realistic strategy that takes care of the whole process,
John,
including
David wants to come in from the audience. David.
There's a couple of things which haven't been mentioned in any detail, and that is regarding ISIS, because I think we have to defeat ISIS in some way before we can concentrate on Assad. And that is that we should be concentrating on trying to stop ISIS using the internet in the way that they do, and trying to cut off their financial assets and the way that they get revenue in the millions. And nobody seems to be doing that in any effective way.
Mary Craig.
Absolutely, we have to cut off the flow of finance, of fighters and of arms to Islamic State.
You have 3 years to do that.
We're not engaged in Syria. We're not engaged. As David said, we should have been... I greatly regret my party's position in 2013. We had a mass murderer who used chemical weapons on sleeping children at night in a civilian area of Damascus in eastern Ghouta, and we had that vote, and I came home and I turned on my television and I saw him napalming a school in Syria, and I thought, this is the man that we have allowed to continue. We allowed Assad to continue to murder his own civilians, and then he created a vacuum into which Islamic State have moved, and they have spread their warfare and their jihadi terrorism.
This attitude allows Assad to stay in position.
Actually, no, it's the political framework that was imposed from the beginning that the head of state should step down, which is a narrative that Russia is not going to accept. Russia does not support Assad himself. They support their own narrative. And they were behind that narrative, not Assad himself. When the bombing was discussed in 2013, it was not to take over Assad. The American framework was just to hurt him and not to finish him. So that only prolongs the conflict. The question is that why the UK and the Americans and the other said something that they cannot deliver. Why they said the head of state should step down when the keys are in Moscow. So they should go back to Moscow, talk to Moscow and agree on this.
Thank you for that. Now we must move on now. Fundamental to the Prime Minister's case for bombing Syria is that, as we've just wanted to talk about, it will make the streets of Britain safer. David Cameron told the Commons that the security services have disrupted 7 terrorist plots to attack the UK this year, all of which were linked to ISIS or inspired by their propaganda. Attacking ISIS on their home turf reduces their ability to plan attacks abroad and reduces their appeal, making attacks, much as we've seen in Paris, less likely, or so the logic goes. Does it stand up? Or does bombing simply make us more of a target? Making the case that attacking ISIS makes us safer, the Labour MP, Mary Cray.
Tomorrow, I will be voting to extend UK airstrikes to defeat ISIL terrorists in Syria. This is one of the most important decisions an MP can make, and it's not one that I have taken lightly. ISIL pose a clear threat to Britain. 30 British holidaymakers were murdered on the beach in Tunisia in July, and we know that 7 ISIL-related terror attacks against British people have been stopped in the past year alone. Paris could have been London. We need a fresh diplomatic effort to bring peace to Syria, and the Vienna talks offer a real hope of that, with Russia, Saudi Arabia and Iran all around the table for the first time. But there is no hope of negotiating with ISIL. We must stop the flow of fighters, finance and arms to their headquarters in Raqqa. And we need military action to stop them murdering Syrians and Iraqis and to disrupt their propaganda machine, which poisons the minds of our young people to commit appalling acts. For the past 14 months, we've carried out airstrikes to defeat ISIL in Iraq. It makes no sense to turn our planes back at the Syrian border and allow ISIL to regroup there. The United Nations has called on countries to use all necessary measures to defeat ISIL, our common enemy. Actions have consequences, but so too does inaction. We must act to keep our country safe.
Thank you very much, Mary Cray. And now suggesting that airstrikes make us less secure is Matthew Paris.
I have no certainties with which to confront David Cameron's apparent certainties, but there's something many of us who don't want Britain to join the bombing are hesitant about saying, but suggest is true. We fear that killing people in Raqqa may put British cities at greater risk. Is it cowardly, is it irresponsible to say that? I can only speak for myself. If I were persuaded by the Prime Minister that Britain's bombers in Syrian skies would in the end make the world safer than exposing our own citizens to a possible temporary increase in the risk of terrorism here would be a sacrifice that we should make. But I don't believe David Cameron is in the position to feel confident this will happen. He doesn't know enough, none of us does, to say that. Yet he puts that assertion right at the centre of his argument. Where are these ISIL terrorist command and control HQs that Mary talks about, that we're going to vaporise? Modern terrorism doesn't need physical HQs. Tornado bombers are useless against the internet and the mobile phone. The inevitable collateral killing of thousands of uninvolved Syrians, together with our country's clear identification with this rain of fire, has a terrible potential to breed new enemies. I'll be honest, I cannot be sure the Prime Minister is wrong, but I'm pretty sure he isn't as confident as he says. I wonder whether he doesn't really know what will happen, but just feels it's inappropriate that a big fight is taking place in a just cause and Britain isn't in it. For me, that isn't enough.
Yeah. David Aronovich, there are no certainties. There are no certainties. France is in the forefront. Look what happened in Paris. You don't know, of course, that homegrown terrorists, as they were in France, homegrown terrorists in Britain will not react to attacks by Britain on ISIS.
France was also attacked back in January when the cause for that was people making cartoons by very roughly the same people. And actually, Mary's argument was more subtle than you allowed, Matthew, because she wasn't talking about command and control centres in quite that way. What she was saying was that the example of having territory, which you called the caliphate, was something that was acting as a propaganda pool to jihadis, as well as being some kind of place where organisation could happen uninterrupted and relatively unscrutinised. And I think that's a strong point, and I think you need to deal with it.
But Mary Craig, isn't part of the problem, though, that actually by going on the attack, ISIS wants us to attack them. They want to take that attack out, and yet this is a hydra-headed beast, isn't it?
They don't want us to attack them. They want us to leave them alone, to regroup, to gain in strength, to recruit more fighters, and then in a time of their own choosing, they will choose to attack us. That has been their methodology. They now control an area the size of Great Britain. We've managed in Iraq to take back about a third of the territory that they've taken. But as long as they're able to be there and to say, we're administering it, we're paying salaries, they are able to recruit people to come and murder other people.
Essentially, ISIS is acting like a state, you know, with its own health service, with its own oil and so forth. We're allowing that to happen. We've got to stop that.
Well, yes, I agree with you, but you cannot take ground back. Being an infantryman in the army, you cannot take ground back through airstrikes alone. You need to identify those local ground troops that's going to take that ground. Nobody can. And therefore, it does beg the question, if you can't supply the ground troops, and there's a great disagreement about this as to where they're going to come from, you should think twice about committing to military action until you know where you're going.
But that does not necessarily mean that the streets of Britain will be less safe.
Well, we just don't know. I think Matthew can speak for himself. I mean, we just don't know. What I do know is there's already too many aircraft chasing too few targets in Syria.
Yes, Muslim.
To protect the civilians in the UK and Europe, you should start by protecting the civilians in Syria. And you should give the people the chance to fight their fight. If you want to tackle ISIS, tackle the root of the problem, which is the great aggression, which is the great injustice of the Syrian people.
But David Ronan, just coming back to this point, don't you think that some ISIS sympathiser in this country who's disaffected, who has to stay here because he can't or she can't travel abroad, is more likely to turn their ire on this country now if we go and bomb ISIS?
Well, I can't be absolutely certain that there's nobody like that, but it strikes me that they have any number of reasons that they could give for wanting to attack us as things are, as in fact they gave us examples in Paris and so on, and that actually they don't really need this as a casus belli. The thing that stops them attacking is the fact that our secret security forces have so far stopped them attacking. When we fail, they will attack.
Well, let's hear from you. Yes, the gentleman at the back there, yes.
It seems that uncertainty is a theme tonight, and I think war should only be a last resort. If we're so uncertain about the situation and circumstances there, we need to make sure we've exhausted all our other options. So speed up the peace talks in Vienna, strengthen YPG forces in Kurdish areas of Syria. Let's not go haphazard into this.
But when David Cameron says that we can't rely on our allies like France and America doing this business for us, do you feel that actually that has some purchase?
Of course not, but considering the civilian casualties that have taken place and will take place if we get involved, I mean, that's a very cosmetic argument, saying that, you know,
Anton, you want to come in? Yes.
I think that throughout this debate, that the one thing that we haven't spoken about is what comes next, a comprehensive strategy, an exit strategy. And something that I'm particularly concerned about is the thousands and thousands of people who will become displaced. The refugees, there's a refugee crisis happening across Europe, and it will get worse. And we haven't spoken about how we're going to deal with that, and I think we need to talk about that.
Yes, very quickly.
I agree that the UK should degrade ISIS capabilities and ultimately defeat it, but being an ex-army officer, I'm not sure that airstrikes on their own would make a big difference militarily, and I'm not sure about the impact they would have on our security here in the UK, because we are talking about homegrown terrorism and extremism. We are talking about narratives of hatred here in the UK, and we are talking about lone wolves. So I'm not sure how these airstrikes would help us.
But what you're saying is that not attacking Syria isn't going to be any less likely that we actually have homegrown terrorists wreaking havoc here.
I don't know it'll make it less likely.
But
it might make it more likely. Well, what I'm sure of is that raining bombs down on Raqqa is not going to stop ISIL would-be terrorists plotting, planning, and perhaps carrying out terrorist atrocities all over the world. They'll continue to do this, and the best way to deal with it is intelligence and money.
Intelligence, but in the meantime, you would advocate that we do absolutely nothing. We sit on our hands.
Yes.
You would advocate we
But
sit on our
there is
hands.
a lot of-
Well, the problem is with David Ronovich, there isn't actually an exit strategy. You know, we've been bombing in Iraq for over a year to no great effect.
You don't need an exit strategy when you've just got aircraft. You just stop using the aircraft.
No,
I want to go over to the point that the gentleman made about the YPG. You made a very good point. So if the YPG say to you, we would like some air support for our fight against ISIS, you would presumably be in favour of it, because they're the people on the ground. It's no use saying to them, go on, fight ISIS on the ground, we support you. But by the way, no planes if you require some close support. So presumably you'd want to see that. I think that's what we want to see. I think raining bombs down on Raqqa would be really bad targeting by the RAF if that's simply what they did. I don't imagine that's what they're planning.
But if this escalates as a result of airstrikes, if there's much more engagement and we're not getting anywhere, is it absolutely the case that you think that Britain should never put troops on the ground?
No, it's not the case at all.
You do think there should be troops?
I'm not speaking for my colleagues here, but I think that there was a very good argument, for instance, to send an international force to secure Palmyra. I think it could have been done. It wouldn't have taken that much effort.
And it would have sent a signal, John Barron.
No, I completely disagree. David supported the Iraq War, and that was a gross error. You put Western troops into yet another intervention in this region, and it will just flame the sectorianism and the religious divides.
What do you think's happening now?
Who's going to settle that religious divide now? Because in fact, there's so many different asking for, so many different groups in Syria wanting different things, Christians among them. You're never going to settle it.
No, and that's my point. That's the concern. The coalition, if you like, of Free Syrian Army facing Assad at the moment could splinter into 1,000 militia, as we saw in Libya. And that brings us back to the gentleman's point about exit strategy. When we talk about a comprehensive strategy, long term, that includes the exit strategy. It's got to include an achievable goal. It's got to include who's going to command that ground.
I'm not clear what you want to do.
But in that case,
what you want to do.
So in that case, can you say, if you do not believe that we have an exit strategy, is what you're saying just now that really what we have to do, realistically, is leave Bashar al-Assad in position now?
What I'm saying is we need to identify, by whatever means, who are the ground forces that are going to take...
That's a yes.
That are going to take this territory, because without ground forces, I think all of us can accept, or most anyway, that airstrikes alone will...
But it strikes me that if that is what you're saying, then ultimately, if we don't have those forces on the ground, then you do have to leave Bashar al-Assad where he is. That is the only alternative.
Well, yes. I mean, I think there is a point where you've got to say which is the
political
greatest
solution doesn't mean that.
Which is the greatest threat?
David.
No. I think Matthew Parris's words are rather irresponsible in raining bombs down. Nobody's suggesting you rain bombs down. The only person to do that was Assad.
It seems to be what
let me
happens
finish.
in Yemen.
What we should be doing is to target bombs, which Britain wants to do, and also to cut off their supplies. If we hit ISIS as well as we can, we'll disrupt their ability to take effect against us.
Matthew Parris, respond to that, please.
Yes, that's the aim. It's always the aim to target. You never aim to exact collateral damage, but you always end up doing it.
Right, well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we're coming into the closing moments of our programme, so we want some final thoughts. Final thoughts, David Aronovich.
My final thought is that actually we're not being asked to do very much. And in fact, all we're being asked to do is to continue what we're already doing in Iraq. What we would be doing would be little enough, but it would be something and it would help.
John Barron.
We've got to make there's no easy decisions in foreign policy, just hard choices. What we've got to decide is who presents the greatest threat to the West. Is it Assad or is it ISIL? If the answer to that question is ISIL, then we have got to identify how best to capture that ground with local forces. And at the moment, because we cannot answer those questions, and we don't have answers to questions like what is the exit strategy, what is the follow-through, we should be very cautious, because the more you intervene, the more you take responsibility for events on the ground.
Yes.
Mary Craig.
The United Nations have called on all countries to use all necessary means to tackle the global terror threat posed by ISIS. We must tackle their ideology at home, we must work against them in Syria, and we must take all steps to reduce the loss of civilian life in that country.
If any of you here who are undecided have actually firmed up your opinion, could you tell me, have you firmed up your opinion, yes or no, for airstrikes?
I'm more anxious.
You're more anxious.
I'm feeling much more anxious about going to war. And I also, if they're asking for all necessary actions, I want to see a stop of funding of all money. Yes. There should be no money going.
Emma.
Yeah, I think I've also actually moved more to the anti-airstrike position, purely because it sounds a bit to me like airstrikes is one thing, but it sounds like we're going to snowball into something else that we've been in before, which is another Iraq.
And you haven't spoken, the gentleman at the back there. Are you less undecided or more undecided?
I think there's no clear evidence that bombing Syria will make London or Manchester safer.
Thank you.
I haven't heard anything of that tonight.
Thank you all very much indeed. Now, that's just about all we've got time for. But tomorrow morning's front pages, less than half the voters back airstrikes on Syria, according to The Times. In The Independent, Britain is on the verge of entering a conflict in Syria in which its political and military strategy is based on wishful thinking and poor information. The Daily Telegraph, Cameron launches an all-out assault on Labour leader as Commons prepares to vote tonight for war in Syria. And the headline in the Telegraph is Corbyn, the terror sympathiser. Well, thank you very much to our panel and to our audience here. That's all we have time for tonight from this special on Syria. We wait for the vote tomorrow night. Good night.